I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. A young Syrian boy died on Monday after being pulled from the sea when a boat capsized off the Greek island of Lesbos. His death is the first of many others that are expected as Turkey opens its borders to the EU for migrants and refugees. He escaped the war and destruction in Syria only to die while traveling for a better life in Europe. Thousands continue to flee from their homes in Syria as the war intensifies to find safety. But it seems like countries near and surrounding Syria are more worried about the crisis at their own borders, a crisis in which Syrians like the 3-year-old Alan Kurdi are seeking safety and a better life in their country. On today's show, we take a closer look at how the humanitarian crisis is unfolding and what more can be done to protect those who are vulnerable. Joining us for this discussion is Emre, who has joined the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies. He focuses mainly on Turkey and EU relations. He joins us from Istanbul. Also joining us is Professor Lyal Sunga, who's an international law expert joining us from Rome. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Kaya, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we talk about so many people leaving Turkey to go towards the EU, what is one of the main reasons or some of the main reasons why we're seeing such a large number of people headed that way in the first place?
Most of these people are coming from war-torn countries like Syria or countries in deep crises like Iraq or Afghanistan and others. So they are seeking better lives. So did they find that in Turkey? Yes, for many, for millions now. But the situation in Turkey is also really tense, especially economically, and also the rising social tensions, which are linked to the economic situation. So the thousands of people, and now we are talking almost about hundreds of thousands of people who are seeking to go to Europe, are looking to find something else than being beaten on the border.
Right. And of course, these are people, as mentioned, have come from war-torn areas. They are seeking a better life. That's their main intention there. But when we talk about these people, groups of people who are moving from Turkey to the European Union, Bulgaria, Greece, other places, there is this dilemma of what language to use. Many people are calling them refugees. Others are referring to them as migrants. Professor Sunga, could you give us more clarity on this? These people who are moving from Turkey to the European Union, would they be claimed as refugees or migrants?
In case of the Syrian, people leaving Syria, it's very much like a refugee situation, because if you take the strict definition of the 1951 Refugee Convention, it says that there has to be a well-founded fear of persecution, and that is the definition of refugee in a narrow sense. And many of these people can show that. But over the last many years, it has become really very much apparent that generalized violence or a state of war produces every bit of as much suffering and danger to people, even if you're not being persecuted as such in a particular situation. The dangers are still out there, especially for children and vulnerable parts of the population. I wouldn't want to nitpick too much in terms of the strict definition. Having said that, I would say that Europe and North America has been using a narrower definition than what's been used in Latin America and the African countries and Asia, which tend to be more flexible on which persons qualify for refugee status.
Professor Sunga, that is an point, and one that I was trying to get at with trying for you to expand on this definition a little more. When you say that these countries are using a more narrow idea of what it means to be a refugee, that seems to be a defense that they're also using, that these people are not in fact refugees. There is a choice involved in them moving towards Europe. Do you see that as the case there?
Well, I mean, it is true that economic migrants don't have the same rights as asylum seekers, but I wouldn't call these people economic migrants. They're really fleeing danger. So it's very close to, or I would say, is a really refugee situation. I think that the problems are not as much in the definition. That is part of the issue. It is the whole way that Europe could be a little bit more generous in terms of the numbers. The numbers that they're admitting under the EU-Turkey deal were not that great. And having said that, I mean, it depends which country you're talking about. Germany, for example, has admitted a lot of refugee, asylum seekers. And, there is a difference between economic migrants, people just seeking a better life in general, and those fleeing the type of situation you have in Syria, which is really highly dangerous, as we all know. So, it's easy to say, well, everybody seeking a better life should have a right to that, but that's not actually the case in international law. And there is a big difference between economic migrants and people fleeing dangerous situations of war-torn countries, is what you see in the Syrian situation, or for that matter, Afghanistan. I mean, a lot more Afghan refugees have been coming across into Europe than Syrians, but depending on which time frame you take.
Right. Thank you for expanding on that. Professor Sunga, stay with me. Mr. Kaya, when we talk about the EU-Turkey deal, which first came about in 2016, and the parts of it that were observed by both sides and the parts that weren't, what do you make out of the case? Is this just about the funds not being allocated to Turkey?
I mean, the result that we see in Turkey from the deal is that it's really mitigated. Where in one part we have yes, there's a bit more than half of the money promised, which has been delivered to several ministers, Ministry of Health and Education, etc. But on the other hand, the Turkish government wanted to have a bit more control on how to deal with the money they received. On the plus side, there was some other aspects of the deal. The deal didn't come as just funding. The Turkish government was expecting visa liberalization towards the EU for Turkish citizens, and maybe a modernization of the custom union. So the deal was not a standalone deal. There were many aspects of it, and. The Turkish argument is that they did what the deal was mainly about, to keep the migrants inflow to Europe, to stop it at the Turkish border, and they seem to be to have a disillusion towards what the EU has done. And we see it today as the government does not want any more money, and they openly stated they just refused €1 billion from Europe.
Right. Mr. Kaya, let's try to unpack the situation a little more on Turkey's end. They've opened the borders for these migrants to enter Europe, but they also have closed their borders with Syria. How does this unfold for those Syrians that are trying to flee? What is to be expected in the coming days?
I mean, the Turkish authorities can close the Syrian border as much as they want, but one thing we learned in the last decade is that you cannot stop people who wants to leave war, who are persecuted daily and living under the bombs. So at one point, Turkey will have to open its borders, which is being more and more under pressure of refugees pushed by, or internally displaced people pushed by the Assad regime towards Turkey. And so when we look at on the ground, what's happening in Syria is the regime has a really established plan to push these people towards Turkey. There's no other option, no other scenario for the regime. They don't want these people there, and they want to push them towards the border. On the ground, the military operations are going on this way, pointing to that direction, and also all the statements made by the regime, by the sectarian elite, military elite of the regime throughout the years. They don't want these people in Syria.
Right.
So the demographic change that the regime is doing right now has worked until Idlib. And Turkey is asking to the international community to step up and stop that from happening even more.
Right, and it does seem, in fact, that Turkey now wants, as the communications director of Turkey stated, that they want the burden of these refugees should be shared by the world. It's not just their own at this point in time. Let's take a listen to what Greece's defense minister had to say in regards to the unfolding situation at their border.
Those that have entered Greek territory have been arrested and detained. And in my mind, this is an illegal way of entering one country.
But it's clearly
borders.
It's clearly possible to get through.
Professor Lyal, Sunga, as we heard the Greece minister state, in his mind, this is an illegal way of entering their country. Also, what we've been seeing are footages where these people on boats in the sea are being attacked or being, in many ways, being punished for trying to even enter there. Now, Amnesty International, in juxtaposition of what the Greece minister had to say, said everyone has a right to seek asylum. Deporting people without due process could mean sending them back to the horrors of war or expose them to grave human rights violations. Now, trying to understand this situation here, on one hand, we try to put people in neat boxes saying they're refugees, they're migrants, but at the end of the day, they're trying to enter a place for safety. And when governments are reacting this way, what type of trials and tribulations do they put them through?
Well, I would rather first say that the island of Lesbos and some of the other Greek islands have actually a very long tradition of welcoming refugees. And I think the difficulty is, since the 1990s with former Yugoslavia and even with this crisis as well. So I don't think we can just blame the places that are the reception points that people are coming into. There has been some right-wing protests, etc., and some violence as well, also from the far left. But looking at it more deeply, it means that Europe has to have a more coordinated strategy, and you mentioned burden sharing. That's very important. Some countries in Europe have been very, very generous, and others, for example, the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, have not taken hardly any refugees and taken any commitment to provide safe haven or resettlement. I would, think that one has to look a little bit more deeply. One thing that concerns me is that President Erdogan's approach on this has been very sudden, and I hope it's not linked to the setback it had with 36 soldiers killed in February 27th in Syria, in Idlib, because Turkey has been lobbying for NATO and EU support in its campaign in Syria. Now, why now in this particular time, a few days after that incident, has the Turkish administration?
Right, Professor Lyal, Sunga, just trying to take. I understand where you're going with this, but just trying to put things back in to how the refugee situation has been for Turkey. Almost 3.7 million refugees have been accepted by them. They have shouldered the burden of a majority of these Syrian refugees. For any state to be able to move towards a better future, not just for their own country, but for those refugees alike, that's an enormous burden. Don't you feel like it is time for the world to shoulder this burden?
Oh, there's no doubt about that. And by the way, I would often think that, we talk about refugee burden. There's a whole much more radical approach, which could see, much more liberalization of refugees' rights and asylum seekers so that they can be empowered to work and to support themselves and to be part of the economy, which can be actually very beneficial for receiving countries. Many of the people that leave Syria and other countries are very entrepreneurial, but and Turkey has been very generous.
Mr. Kaya, on everything that Professor Sunga said, what do you have to say to it? How do you see the situation?
Turkey is already doing a lot, and the Turkish state, the Turkish government, has been more than generous towards the Syrian refugees all around the conflict. What Turkey now wants, it's not more money, more help from its European allies or its American allies, but to step up in Syria. And not for only a political reason or something. Turkey has no political gain in Idlib. Turkey's main objective in Idlib is today to have a safe zone or to have a place for the Syrians there to live peacefully. Because under the regime, this will not be the case. Under the regime, there is no peaceful future for Syrians.
Right.
So what should the international community do? Put aside Turkey, X country. What should the international community do for its own benefit, actually, and perhaps as a responsibility, is to step up in Syria to create a safe zone by respecting Syria's territorial integrity, territorial sovereignty. But to step up there and have this zone to offer Syrians, at least for now, a livable place.
Right.
And that's I believe the main objective of Turkey's campaign now with and lobbying with European capitals.
Right. Professor Lyal, Sunga, just a last question to you. Now, we have been seeing propping ups of many right-wing governments all across Europe, and this does bring to mind the question whether the fact that they are not able or unwilling to accept refugees is the case of not having the capacity to do so or not having the political will of wanting to do so. What's your take on this?
No, certainly there's a certain amount of hardening of opinion, and that's regrettable. And that's why also governments across Europe have been treading a bit carefully. And Emre is right that one has to look at the root causes, because ultimately the situation in Syria, which is producing the refugee outflow, is a very serious one, and that requires all sorts of political negotiation through the United Nations, etc. But we've seen that hasn't gone very far. So, I agree with Emre that one has to go to root causes to solve this problem. Otherwise, we are looking at quick fixes, and it does create some resentment also in Turkey and in surrounding countries. And Jordan and Iraq has taken also refugees from Syria, and as well as produced its own refugee outflows. So it's a universal problem that has to be dealt with much more comprehensively in a coordinated fashion. And right-wing reaction is always a threat on the horizon. I agree with that statement that you're making.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Lyal, for joining us and taking out the time to talk to us. Mr. Kaya, now, when we hear about what is happening at the European borders, it's a refugee crisis. That's the narrative that's told all across the world. But when we hear about countries such as Turkey and many others, which are a part of the developing nations that are housing and hosting millions of refugees, we don't hear them talking about a refugee crisis. Do you think Europe is inflating the problem?
European countries have their own reason to make it big. They have their main internal political issues. Domestic politics right now in Europe is impacted by a populist wave. And obviously the neighboring countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq, or Jordan in the case of Syria, or Pakistan in the case of Afghanistan, we don't have much choice. The developing countries don't have much choice when it comes to accepting these refugees. So there is not much discussion also about it. You cannot really close the border forever. And that's also the point of the Turkish government nowadays. They can keep the Syrians out right now, but it will not last if there's not a more long-term solution.
Right.
And that's what the Europeans have to understand today, that the border of Europe does not end at the Greek-Turkish border or the Bulgarian-Turkish border or south of Italy. Nowadays, the European border is also Turkey's border with Syria. And if, in any case, let's take the scenario that Turkey accepts these 2 million. Turkey could not offer anymore the same standards that it did with the previous wave of refugees. So these refugees will ultimately also go towards Europe because of this ideal of a better life.
Right, Mr. Kaya, stay with me on that. That's an important point, that when you see an influx of people coming to your borders, of course, trying to reach safety, but there is such a huge and overwhelming number. You are not able to provide them the same standards as you could with a different number. On that point, I want to also introduce Mr. Adrian Pereira, who's an analyst and executive director of North-South Initiative, which is working to create social justice awareness and human rights awareness. He joins us from Malaysia. Thank you so much, Mr. Pereira, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, talking about providing refugees a livable standard, we're hearing about refugee camps all across the world, which are basically not able to function as the way that they should be in providing these refugees the basic necessities. Where does the world need to take the narrative from this point onwards? Not just taking in refugees, but actually providing them a livable standard.
Yeah, so actually, if you look at the Global Compact on Refugees, there's already frameworks to address the matter. And if you study the pledges by different international organizations, these problems shouldn't even be on the table. But unfortunately, we've seen the hypocrisies of different governments who have made pledges but not able to resolve. So it's quite tragic. Yeah.
But even when we talk about this global compact for how to take forward the matter of refugees, it doesn't seem like everyone's on the table, even at face value.
That's true, but different governments have made pledges, and there are mechanisms that have been proposed but failed. So, for example, we were supposed to have early warning indicators and how to deal with when crisis bursts out. So if you look at this current situation, I think it shows that the different states involved have not been able to cope with this crisis on a short notice. Yeah.
Right. You're talking about these mechanisms failing. Why do you think that happened in the first place? What caused countries not being able to make use of what were these indicators?
Yeah, so specifically for this problem, you can see that people have been made bargaining chips in the regional crisis. People have been pawned in this whole geopolitics. It's so sad, but in the terms of the UN analysis, it shows how when conventions are voluntary and there's no accountability, it's bound to fail. So once again, the global community has to take responsibility for this crisis.
Mr. Kaya, is this Turkey's way of making the community take responsibility for pledges and for agreements?
Yes, of course. Turkey wants to show that this issue is not only Turkish or Lebanese or any other regional country's problem. It's not a neighbor of Syria problem. This issue is bigger, and it will. I mean, we already saw that scenario before. It's not new. I mean, the refugees in 2015 didn't stop at the Turkish-Greek border. They went beyond, and Turkey wants to show that it can have its responsibility, and it will. It does it already in Syria, but it needs support from other countries, which will also be affected, not randomly chosen countries somewhere. These countries will also be directly affected by any catastrophe, any disaster scenario that will happen in Idlib.
Right. That will, of course, ripple across through the region. Mr. Adrian Pereira, we've been talking about trying to bring the human element into focus here, not just the politics, but what happens with the people who are fleeing for their lives. Take us through the journeys of these people. How do they make their ways across to, especially Syrian refugees, make their way across to European states, to Turkey? How is that journey like from the accounts you've been hearing?
So there are syndicates which organize the people through different, even social media and other communication manners. So it's very precarious. There's no one monitoring. Smuggling and trafficking happens, including the routes taken by economic refugees. So it's actually a mixed migration situation. I think it's very unfortunate that we are not looking at the root causes and merely trying to solve this problem as it happens. Yeah, and I don't think that in terms of acceptance, if you look at the whole global geopolitics with right-wing politics on the rise, it's very high risk that these people are taking Of course, they are pushed, but on both sides, politicians are taking advantage of this crisis. And end of the day, nobody is really prepared to give them safe travel. Yeah.
Right. That is, we're going to discuss further on in the show. Thank you so much, Mr. Adrian Pereira, for joining us, and Mr. Emre Kaya for joining us. We're going to talk more about how a solution or any agreement can be manifest when we see belligerent governments on both sides. But that's going to happen after the break. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. While we talk about what is happening after Turkey opens its borders for migrants and refugees and them crossing into Europe. Now joining us for this discussion is Mr. Nawaz Chowhan, who's the chairman of National Commission for Human Rights Pakistan. He joins us from Islamabad. Also joining us is Mr. George Szamuely, who's an international relations expert, joining us from Budapest. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Chowhan, I'd like to begin with you. Now, we've been talking a lot about the politics involved, the motives involved in everything that's unfolded so far. But do you think when this issue has been being covered in the past, but is also being covered in the present times, people are forgetting the human angle to it, what it's actually about, these refugees who are fleeing a land which is in the mode of war and destruction? Yes.
I would first of all start with some historical background. The issue of refugees was recognized after the First World War. And this initially dealt with the Russians, Armenians, and the German refugees. Later, after World War II, bodies were created to deal with refugees from Europe, Palestine, and Korea. Then we have the United Nations-led 1951 Convention, which dealt with the whole world, unlike the International Refugee Organization, which preceded this. Now, what is the situation is best described in the 50 years report of the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees. It says that the United Nations Refugees Convention is significant in two respects. First, although it was initially limited to refugees from Europe, it provides a definition of refugees as someone outside or her own country and unable to return as a result of a well-founded fear of persecution on grounds of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of social groups. The NCHR has a mandate to provide both international protection and solutions for refugees. Solutions to refugee problem have traditionally been divided by...
Mr. Chowhan, when you talk about the UN needing to provide solutions to refugee problems, we are seeing that they are failing on that front. Pretty much, it's abysmal, the situation there. Looking onwards, do you feel like any other way or any other mechanism is in place to find solutions, come to the table and discuss the issues?
I think the major power, which is also responsible for creating conflicts, like in the case of Afghanistan and elsewhere, is the real strength and the real body who can make them all come on the table like it has done in case of Afghanistan and ensure that the conflicts in the world subside. Now we have the Myanmar issue, which just is being ignored by the world. The Afghanistan issue was accepted because America was involved and their troops had to withdraw and there was no other solution to it. And then we have now the case of Yemen, where all this is happening, and United Nations has a clout there if they can do it. So the world powers have to meet, like in the case of Yalta, like in the case of San Francisco Conference, because unless they unite together and lay emphasis and the Security Council provides the sanctions, well, this will not end.
Right.
The
Mr.
United
Chowhan,
Nations Secretary
stay with me. Sorry to interrupt, but you brought an important point, which was the reality of the double standards that are applied in cases like this. Mr. Szamuely, when we talk about Turkey housing almost 3.7 million refugees and Europe also taking a number of refugees in, but now showing the stark reaction towards them, do you see that double standard in play?
It is true that there is an obligation on the part of states to take in refugees as defined in the Convention of 1951, as my colleague pointed out. However, such refugees, alleged refugees, have to come in legally. There is no obligation on the part of any country in the world to allow in people illegally. Coming in legally means coming in through the legal points of entry.
Mr. Szamuely, so here's my question. Here's my question to you. We started off the show talking about a Syrian boy who, off the coast of Lesbos, died because his boat capsized. No one puts their lives in that kind of danger unless there is an urgency to do so. Do we agree on that point?
Well, it depends on what you mean by urgency. I mean, there are certainly people who deem it urgent to go to Europe because Europe is a very nice place.
But to put their lives at risk to go to a nice place, they're not going for a vacation there, are they?
In Europe. So the point is this: countries have no obligation simply to allow in anybody who breaks in. I mean, any more than you have an obligation to allow in anyone who wants to break into your house. There are legal ways to come in.
Right. With me on that point, this is where I want to take this question to Mr. Chowhan. Mr. Chowhan, when we talk about not knowing the identity of people who are fleeing a land or coming to your borders, what is the due process there? How do you process requests? How do you deal with that situation? Many people don't have IDs when they flee conflict or war.
Actually, I don't agree with my friend from Budapest, my favorite place. The question is, there's a humanitarian aspect. And European Union, United States and all are responsible to react to that in a positive way. We are grateful to Germany, who don't have qualms with this idea. They've allowed Syrians, and I was there in Germany to see how nicely they were dealing with it. Now, the question is if other European countries have a bias towards them.
Mr. Chowhan, you're saying that there is a bias there towards these refugees, and that's why they're not being dealt with like Germany has dealt with them.
I would say that Turkey has to allow them to go to Europe. By the way, Turkey is already holding about millions of Syrian refugees. We should be grateful to Turkey, but please appreciate how has the Iraq and the Syrian crisis created the genesis. Now, the bombing, destruction of people, and then creation of the governments, all has been done by the West. And the West should feel responsibility on humanitarian grounds. And they are even proffering human rights as an important and essential part of humanity and rights everywhere in the world. And they have to accept that. And if there's a conflict, through their influence, these people will go back. That's the only answer. To say that the Europeans have no obligation to it will not be persuasive. If the Germans were given refugees, if the Russians were given refugee help and so on.
Mr. Chowhan, I want to, my last question to Mr. Szamuely. Mr. Szamuely, now, whether Europe likes it or doesn't like it, there is a humanitarian crisis at its border. What is the game plan from this point onwards for the European states within the European Union?
Well, the game plan, as far as the Europeans are concerned, will be, as I pointed out, that anyone who wants to come in must come in legally, either through the European consulates in Turkey or via legal ports of entry into Greece.
Right. And sorry, since I'm running short on time, I do want to get in there as well. Is there any talk about greater support for the border states, namely Greece and Bulgaria, at this point in time by other European states?
Well, I think there is. And the EU has promised support for Greece in particular to secure its borders. But it's clear that the EU is not going to allow what happened in 2015. I mean, that's just out of the question. There isn't going to be that mass migration of 2015 because Europe paid a heavy price for that, and it doesn't want to go through all that again.
Right. On that, we've run short of time. Thank you so much, Mr. George Szamuely, for joining us from Budapest, giving your insight. Thank you, Justice Ali Nawaz Chowhan, for joining us from Islamabad. The important point to keep in focus right now is that this is a humanitarian crisis for the people of Syria, less alone for those within the European state or anywhere else. And that's what needs to be kept in mind when we talk about what is happening with those people who are fleeing violence and conflict. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next week with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.